My son ditched his mother's funeral, deeming it unworthy of his effort. As I laid my wife to rest, he was lounging on Florida's sunny shores. 7 days later, he rang me up, begging, "Dad, the house payment's overdue." My reply was icy. "It doesn't matter to me now." He was stunned, yet that was merely the start. Before we go on, kindly subscribe to the channel and drop a comment with your current local time. My fingers shook as I tapped Timothy's name on my phone for the 4th time in half an hour. The funeral director's compassionate look twisted my gut, but I averted my eyes, turning instead to Margaret's coffin. The varnished oak shone beneath the dull morning sky, with white lilies spilling over the brass fittings that captured every fleeting ray of sunlight piercing the thick clouds. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Nearby, family members pulled up in dark vehicles, their quiet conversations blending with the far-off drone of the landscaping team. Aunt May gripped a handkerchief, her eyes already swollen. Cousin Robert adjusted his tie, glancing at his watch. Everyone appeared to understand their position, their part in this last farewell. Everyone but my son. 4 rings. 5, 6, Dad. Timothy's voice finally broke through, but something seemed off. Sounds from the background seeped in, chuckles, tunes, chatter that didn't fit a work conference. "Timothy, son, where are you? The service begins in half an hour." A hesitation. More of that odd ambient noise. Was that ocean waves? "Dad, I won't be there. I've got critical work to deal with." The statement struck me like icy water. I clutched the side of Margaret's coffin, sensing the sleek wood under my hand. She would have figured out the right words. She always knew how to connect with him when I failed. What work could outweigh your mother's burial? Another hesitation. This one stretched longer. When Timothy responded, his tone had a sharpness I'd never encountered. Indifferent, nearly apathetic. "Truthfully, this entire event isn't worth my effort. Quit pestering me." The phone grew weighty in my grasp. All around, the scene carried on its soft rhythm. Attendees settling into chairs. The minister organizing his script. Groundskeepers tidying remote trails. But I remained rooted, trapped between the woman I'd cherished for 37 years and the son who was turning his back on us both. "Timothy, your mother, she's—" The dial tone sliced through my faltering words like a knife. I gazed at the device's dark display, my image warped on its surface. Worth his effort. Margaret had journeyed 6 hours in a blizzard when Timothy suffered pneumonia during his university days. She'd skipped her own sister's birthday celebration to watch his marketing pitches. She stood up for him to her acquaintances when he'd been too occupied to drop by for 3 straight Christmases. The initial raindrops brushed my cheek, blending with something hotter. "Mr. Cole." The funeral director neared, his tone soft yet businesslike. "We'll need to seat the family soon." I tucked the phone into my coat pocket and faced the incoming kin. Somehow I succeeded in greeting arriving relatives with handshakes, receiving their sympathies with rote replies. "Thanks for being here. She would have valued this." Yes, she battled courageously. But my thoughts stayed fixed on Timothy's voice, on that nonchalant rejection of all Margaret had represented to him. "To us." Aunt May grasped my arm. "Where's Timothy?" "I haven't spotted him." "He'll arrive shortly." I found myself saying, the falsehood sour on my tongue. "Vital work." The phrase felt like disloyalty even as I uttered it. Margaret merited honesty. Even now, particularly now. But positioned next to her coffin, encircled by folks who'd journeyed hours to pay tribute to her legacy, I couldn't force myself to reveal that our soul child had picked something different over this ultimate parting. Thunder growled above as I led my relative toward the front line of collapsible seats. The service would proceed regardless of Timothy. Margaret's existence would be commemorated, her legacy respected, her departure observed with the respect she'd gained through years of educating, caring, contributing. But as I settled into the front row, fixing my dark tie once more, I couldn't dispel the resonance of my son's words. "This entire event isn't worth my effort." The minister stepped to the lectern, his Bible open to a ribbon-marked page. Behind him, Margaret's photo beamed from its stand, encircled by those white lilies she'd always preferred. In the image, her eyes radiated the same tenderness they'd displayed on our wedding day, the same optimism they'd held when Timothy took his initial steps, the same affection they'd provided through every tough phase our family had endured. Rain started pouring steadily now, tapping against the fabric awning overhead. Somehow, I managed to greet arriving kin with handshakes and claim my spot in the front row. The minister's voice resonated across the assembly, warm and solemn, crafting verbal portraits of Margaret's life that ought to have swelled my heart with appreciation. Ought to have, but failed to. Margaret was a committed parent who always prioritized kin, he declared, motioning toward her picture. She trusted in love's ability to mend any hurt. My phone vibrated against my chest. I attempted to disregard it, redirecting my focus to the minister's speech, but my thoughts kept wandering to Timothy's voice, to that scornful inflection that still echoed in my mind. Another vibration, then one more. Around me, about 40 attendees sat in polite quiet. Cousin Robert wiped his eyes with a cloth. My shoulders trembled with silent cries. They were present, attentive, revering Margaret's legacy while her own offspring was. The phone vibrated once more. I scanned the area, ensuring no one spotted my diversion, then discreetly pulled the gadget from my coat pocket. The display revealed 3 alerts from Instagram regarding Timothy's spouse, Sarah. I'd never been keen on social platforms, but Margaret had urged me to follow Sarah's profile to view images of their trips. She offered her time generously, the minister went on, instructing kids not merely in school subjects but in principles of compassion and honesty. The irony struck me hard. I clicked the first alert. The screen burst with vivid blues and greens, a sharp opposition to the dreary ritual around me. A clip started playing on its own, depicting clear waters washing over pale sand. Palm fronds swayed behind, and the sound captured faint reggae rhythms mingled with giggles. Then Sarah's voice. What an ideal day in Miami. The conditions are fantastic. Miami. The view swept across a hotel pool where folks relaxed in bathing suits, beverages in hand, shaded loungers, beach games afar. Sheer holiday bliss, uploaded 15 minutes prior with a tag verifying what I suspected. Miami Beach, Florida. My hold on the phone strengthened. So that's what Timothy implied by critical work. While we assembled to enter his mother, while kin voyaged from 3 states to offer respects, while I sat attempting to maintain our family's fragments, he was enjoying cocktails by the sea. Margaret's deepest delight, the minister stated, stemmed from seeing her kin flourish and succeed. The clip kept rolling. Sarah's hand entered the shot, clutching a colorful beverage adorned with fruit and small parasols. In the background, hotel visitors frolicked in the waves, their joyful laughs worlds apart from our grave assembly. I yearned to hurl the phone, to yell, to shatter this serene service with the harsh reality of what sort of son Margaret had nurtured, despite her boundless love and sacrifices. Instead, I returned the gadget to my pocket and compelled my expression into one of fitting sorrow. Allow the minister to complete his homage. Allow Margaret's companions and kin to recall her as she merited. There would be opportunity afterward to digest what Timothy had committed, what he was continuing to do as we venerated the woman who'd granted him existence. But my hands quivered with restrained fury, and my leg jittered uncontrollably against the steel seat. Each phrase lauding Margaret's commitment to kin felt like a blade delving deeper. She'd trusted in love's power to mend hurts, but some hurts were too profound for repair. The minister shut his Bible and moved aside for the subsequent orator, Margaret's old school head who'd known her for 2 decades. As she neared the lectern, fixing her spectacles and organizing her papers, I met the funeral director's gaze, positioned at the rear. He nodded empathetically, likely presuming my evident turmoil arose from typical mourning. If only it were so straightforward. Rain kept pounding the awning above. But in Florida, sunlight beamed. The conditions were fantastic, ideal for leisure, while your mother's remains awaited descent into chilly soil. I muttered a pretext about requiring fresh air to my relative, who clasped my hand sympathetically and proceeded steadily toward the upkeep zone behind the graveyard storage. My fury mounted with every stride, intensified by the disparity between Sarah's upbeat clip and the truth of this overcast dawn. For years, Margaret had adored that boy. 37 years of late-night illnesses, classroom performances, commencement events, employment rehearsals she'd rehearsed with him, romantic guidance he'd ignored. She'd justified him to pals who questioned his lack of visits, invented reasons for skipped festivities, dispatched gift boxes to his pricey Manhattan home. And this was his way of respecting her legacy. Behind the upkeep storage, distant from the service's soft hum, I retrieved my phone with trembling hands. Not anxiety this time, sheer unfiltered wrath. The sort of ire I hadn't experienced since Timothy was 17 and totaled the vehicle while cruising recklessly with buddies who'd egged him on. But even then, Margaret had been present to calm me, to discover the proper phrases. Now I face my rage solo. I called his number without pause, my digits stabbing the display with excess vigor. One ring, two. He likely wouldn't pick up, probably savoring some waterside amenity. Or and what is it now, Dad? His voice held that identical irritated sharpness. But this time I was prepared. Timothy, I just viewed your wife's clip from Miami Beach. Quiet. Just the rush of wind through my device and remote holiday sounds through his. That's not what you believe, Dad. Sarah's merely, don't deceive me. My voice reverberated off the cement storage. The first shout in ages. You're at the shore while we're interring your mother? Another quiet. When he replied, the facade vanished. All right, yes, I'm in Florida. What's the big deal? This burial is a squander of my time. The words struck fiercer than his prior rejection because now I possessed evidence of his heartlessness. While kin occupied folding seats hearing eulogies, while blooms drooped in the downpour, while Margaret's form rested awaiting eternal repose. Her offspring was embracing his finest existence beneath palms, a squander of time. I strode behind the storage, scuffing at scattered pebbles. She bore you. She cherished you when others wouldn't. She supported you against all critics. She's gone, Dad. Timothy's voice pierced my wrath like frost. Lingering to weep won't alter that. I've got living to do. The effortless brutality halted me in my tracks. Living to do? As if Margaret's passing was just a bother disrupting his leisure plans. Rain struck my face, mingling with tears I hadn't noticed streaming. Afar, I could discern the head's voice drifting over the burial ground, recounting tales of Margaret's commitment to her pupils. Tales Timothy would never encounter because shores mattered more than moms. You're no longer my son. The declaration escaped before I could halt it. Decisive as a hammer's blow. Fine, Timothy shot back instantly. Don't contact me anymore. The connection severed. I stared at the display indicating call terminated and promptly hit redial. The phone rang once, then switched to voicemail. I attempted again. The number you're reaching is unavailable. Third try. This caller is blocked. He'd blocked me. While Margaret rested in her coffin 50 yards distant, while kin and pals assembled to venerate her legacy, while rain drenched my burial attire, my son had barred my number to guarantee his getaway persisted without disruption. I tried 2 more times. Each met the identical mechanical denial. The tech he'd employed to display his seaside haven now acted as a barrier between us, intentional and unbreachable. Thunder boomed above and the rain strengthened. Behind me, I could sense the service progressing. Likely Thurman recounting anecdotes from our paired outings 40 years past, when Margaret donned yellow dresses, and Timothy was merely in our visions of future offspring. My phone weighed heavy in my palm, its display mirroring my visage twisted by rain and wrath. Blocked, severed, rejected as completely as Margaret's legacy had been rejected. The upkeep storage provided no cover from the tempest, but I lingered there regardless, allowing the moisture to seep through my coat and trail down my face. In Florida, sunlight persisted. The conditions remained fantastic. Sarah was likely uploading another clip now, documenting their flawless day while we bore our flawed sorrow. Gradually, I returned toward the service, my shoes squishing in the sodden turf turned slushy by the torrent. Through the downpour, I could observe the assembled grievers still positioned under their shielding cover, still absorbing speakers who'd cherished Margaret enough to face this storm for her. Timothy's vacant seat in the front mocked their faithfulness. Margaret had always demanded it stay open just in case he appeared unexpectedly. Hope, she'd termed it. Sometimes hope is our only solace, but hope I was discovering could be a harsh ally. It had prompted me to keep calling his number that morning despite realizing he wouldn't mind. It had led me to label his contact as Timothy's son in my device, as if the tag could safeguard a bond that had already perished. As I neared the gathering's border, my relative noticed me and motioned to the empty spot beside her. The service was approaching its close. I could sense it from how folks shifted in their seats, grabbing tissues, bracing for the ultimate farewell. I assumed my position among Margaret's genuine kin, the individuals who'd opted to attend despite rain and mourning and the basic human challenge of witnessing a loved one vanish eternally. They merited more than my inattention. Margaret merited more than a son who prized shore time over her legacy. The minister resumed the lectern for final thoughts, but I scarcely registered his speech. My thoughts stayed ensnared in that mechanical notice. This caller is blocked. Some hurts, I was discovering, were too profound for Margaret's cherished force of love to repair. I trudged the 100 yards back to the service, each footfall weightier than before, compelling my expression into a facade of suitable mourning. The minister's voice resonated across the assembly as I quietly resumed my seat beside my relative, who clasped my hand without diverting from the lectern. Margaret dedicated her existence to fostering youthful intellects, the minister declared, his tone rich with sincere warmth. She held that every youngster warranted patience, comprehension, and unwavering encouragement. My relative leaned near, murmuring, Margaret was incredibly proud of Timothy. Recall how she'd display his marketing honors to all? Those elegant certificates from New York? My throat constricted. She always perceived the finest in him. He must be heartbroken to skip this. Travel from New York can be awful. I gazed at Margaret's coffin, those white lilies quivering gently in the wind. He had commitments he couldn't evade. The falsehood tasted acrid, but what alternative did I have? That her cherished nephew had selected poolside beverages over her send-off. That he'd brushed off 37 years of parenting as unworthy of his effort. When Timothy was 8, my relative persisted. Unaware of my inner turmoil, Margaret devoted 3 weeks aiding him with that science fair endeavor. Recall the volcano that truly exploded in the kitchen? The recollection struck like a tangible strike. Timothy's thrilled expression, flour and baking soda blanketing the surfaces, Margaret chuckling as she tidied the chaos. Daddy, when will Mama improve? I drew her a picture. 8-year-old Timothy had inquired during her short illness with bronchitis that year. Such straightforward affection, such genuine worry for his mother's health. She never skipped one of his school talks, my relative whispered. Even when ill with the flu, she'd haul herself there. More recollections surged uninvited. Margaret navigating that blizzard to his college when he had pneumonia. Forfeiting her own sister's birthday gathering to witness his marketing talks. Justifying him to pals who pondered his absences. 2 years back, when the physician announced Margaret's prognosis, her initial words concerned Timothy. How do we inform him? She'd murmured, clutching my hand in that clinical room, as if the cancer was a misstep we'd made, something that would let down our son. I'd phoned that evening, my tone firm despite the shake in my hands. Son, your mother's facing some medical problems. Can you come this weekend? Dad works incredibly hectic. You understand? Tell Mom I'm thinking about her. She'd prefer to hear it directly from you. I'll attempt to ring later. He never did. The routine persisted for months. Short calls where Timothy's focus obviously strayed. Visits that shifted from weekly to infrequent, then absent. Justifications about key conferences, essential timelines, professional chances that couldn't pause. Margaret invented excuses for him each instance. He simply frightened Otis. Passing scares the young. Even as she became slimmer, frailer, more reliant on my aid for basic activities, she justified his non-appearance. Perhaps Timothy could join for Thanksgiving, she'd inquired last November, her voice scarcely above a murmur. I'll inquire, I'd vowed, already aware of his response. He's constructing his path, she'd remarked more to herself than me. That's what offspring do. They construct their own paths. But seated here now, surrounded by 40 individuals who'd carved out time for her send-off, I grasped what she'd declined to admit. Timothy hadn't been constructing a path. He'd been forsaking the one that encompassed us. Promise me you'll comprehend him, Margaret had murmured in those concluding weeks. He cares for us in his unique manner. Her unique manner, as if care could be gauged in alibis and hollow vows. The minister wrapped his comments and the assembled grievers stood for concluding prayers. I rose mechanically, my form adhering to customs, while my mind stayed captive in those agonizing months of observing Margaret diminish while awaiting a son who never arrived. Around me, voices merged in known phrases of solace and parting, but all I could perceive was Timothy's voice from 2 hours prior. This entire event isn't worth my effort. My relative dabbed her eyes with a new handkerchief. She was fortunate to have such a committed kin, she muttered. Committed. The term reverberated in my head as the minister shut his Bible and folks started collecting their items. Margaret had been committed. Undoubtedly committed to a son who'd barred his father's number to dodge hassle. Committed to an offspring who'd matured into a man unable of commitment back. The service was concluding, and I still hadn't determined how to account for Timothy's absence to the many kin who'd inquired, how to venerate Margaret's legacy while confronting the reality about the son she'd passed away hoping to glimpse once more. The minister's speech diminished. as I was drawn back to that October dawn 2 years earlier, when all shifted. Dr. Martinez had organized the consultation documents on her desk with practiced efficiency, but her demeanor carried something I'd never witnessed. The cautious impartiality physicians use when conveying crushing news. "The cancer has advanced further than we first believed," she'd stated, her tone expertly tender. "We're considering months, not years." Margaret's hand located mine across the brief gap between our seats. "How do we inform Timothy?" Even then, confronting her own end, her primary worry was shielding our son from harsh reality. I'd phoned him that night, my tone firm despite everything. "Son, your mother's dealing with some health concerns. The doctors aim to begin treatment immediately." "What sort of treatment?" Timothy had questioned, and for an instant I'd detected real worry in his tone. "Chemotherapy? It'll be challenging, but she's resilient." "Well, keep me informed." "I'm certain she'll overcome it." Informed, as if his mother's existence was a platform post. The initial few months weren't dreadful. Timothy came twice, arriving with costly blooms and lingering for supper. He'd appeared truly worried, posing queries about therapy timetables, reactions, outlook. Margaret had flourished under his notice, discussing his job, his residence, his bold schemes for progress. But as the therapies advanced and Margaret's vitality faded, his visits turned into monthly duties rather than gestures of affection. He'd show up with the identical costly blooms, remain for exactly 2 hours, then reference vital meetings or early departures as motives to go. "He's simply developing his profession," Margaret would comment after each shortened stay. "Youth need to concentrate on their tomorrows." By month 6, the visits ceased completely. Calls became concise swaps of vital details. "How's Mom faring?" "She's battling." "Good. Tell her I care." Click. I'd passed those months mastering being both spouse and caretaker, mastering preparing gentle foods Margaret could retain, mastering sorting medication routines, handling claims, transporting to countless doctor visits while jotting notes on procedures I scarcely grasped. The clinic trips were the harshest. Seated beside Margaret's seat during chemo rounds, observing toxin flow into her veins while she attempted to stay upbeat for me. Other sufferers had company, offspring, companions, extended kin rotating support. We had one another, and that seemed sufficient until I recognized it wasn't. Could Timothy drop by this weekend? Margaret had queried one bleak December afternoon, her scarf slipping as she tried to straighten up. "I'm having a decent day. I'd like him to view me appearing improved." I called his number with hands that trembled more from ire than worry. "Dad, it's utterly chaotic here. This client requires changes by Monday, and I'm already delayed. Your mother asked for you specifically. She's stronger today." "That's wonderful. Tell her I'll certainly come soon. Maybe next month when matters settle." Matters never settled. Timothy's justifications grew more detailed, more expert, more conclusive. Significant talks, critical due dates, career prospects that couldn't delay for family duties. Margaret ceased asking outright, but I'd notice her glancing at her phone when it alerted, anticipating calls that never materialized. She'd perk up when I brought up Timothy's name, then deliberately sidestep inquiring when he might appear. The last months were a haze of growing powerlessness. Margaret required assistance with fundamental chores, bathing, clothing, consuming meals I'd learned to make for someone whose hunger had vanished. I'd relocated her bed to the family room so she could view the yard she'd adored, observe birds at the feeder we'd placed outside the pane. "Maybe Timothy could join for Thanksgiving," she'd murmured one November night, her voice hardly audible over the whir of the oxygen machine. I'd called him again, this time abandoning subtlety. "Son, your mother is dying. She wants to see you." "How long does she have?" "The doctors think weeks, maybe a month." "I'll try to arrange something. Work is just insane right now, but family comes first." Family comes first. The lie was so casual, so automatic. I wondered if he even heard himself say it. Thanksgiving came and went. Margaret had been too weak to eat, but she'd insisted I put on football games because Timothy always enjoyed watching with us. She dozed fitfully, waking periodically to ask if he'd called. He hadn't. December brought final decline. Margaret slept most days, waking only for medications and brief conversations that felt like borrowed time. She'd still ask about Timothy, but indirectly now. Is he working hard? Does he sound happy? Tell him his mother loves him. I'd stopped calling by then. What was the point? Timothy had made his choice months ago. Promise me you'll understand him. Margaret had whispered during what turned out to be our last real conversation. Death frightens young people. He'll regret this someday. Regret? As if Timothy's absence was mere fear rather than calculated selfishness. Margaret died on a Tuesday morning in January, her hand still warm in mine as dawn broke through our bedroom window. I'd held her while she drew her final breath, whispering reassurances about Timothy's love that we both knew weren't true. The first call I'd made was to Timothy. "Dad, is everything okay?" "It's pretty early. She's gone, son. Your mother died an hour ago." Silence, then I'll handle the arrangements from here. I know people. People not all come home. Not I need to be there. People who could handle arrangements. While he continued his life uninterrupted, the scraping of folding chairs brought me back to the present. People were standing, gathering coats, preparing to move toward the graveside. Margaret's casket waited, surrounded by those white leaves that reminded me of her garden, her hope, her unwavering faith in a son who'd abandoned her when she needed him most. I rose with the others mechanically, accepting condolences from relatives who had no idea their beloved nephew had chosen vacation over their farewell. The scraping of folding chairs brought me fully back to the present as people gathered coats and moved toward the graveside. Family members approached with gentle touches, hushed condolences, and expectant glances toward the parking area, where they still hoped to see Timothy arrive. Fashionably late but appropriately apologetic. "Margaret would be so proud of this turnout," Cousin Robert said, gripping my shoulder. "She touched so many lives." "Thank you for being here," I replied automatically, the words feeling rehearsed after dozens of repetitions. Mai appeared beside me, clutching her purse and looking around uncertainly. "Shouldn't we wait for Timothy? He must be stuck in terrible traffic." Before I could formulate another careful lie, a familiar voice cut through the murmur of conversation. "Otis." Thurman Hayes stood 3 FT away, his weathered hands folded in front of him. He'd driven an hour from the south side, wearing his good Navy jacket in the same serious expression he'd worn at job sites when something needed fixing. We'd worked construction together for 15 years before I moved into engineering, shared coffee breaks and complaints about supervisors who'd never swung a hammer. "Thurman." I shook his offered hand, surprised by the strength of his grip, the way he held on a moment longer than necessary. "I've known you 40 years, he said quietly, his eyes scanning the crowd behind me. "Where's Timothy? I didn't see him during the service." The direct question caught me off guard while others had asked with gentle concern. Thurman's tone carried the bluntness of old friendship, the right to expect honest answers. "He couldn't make it." The words felt heavier this time. "He's in Florida?" Thurman's eyebrows rose slightly. "Florida today for what?" I glanced around, ensuring we wouldn't be overheard. Other mourners were making their way toward the burial site, voices subdued, movements respectful. Vacation said the funeral wasn't worth his time. The silence stretched between us. Thurman's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Disappointment mixed with recognition, as if he'd suspected something like this but hoped to be wrong. "Margaret would be heartbroken," he said finally. "She never got to say goodbye to him." The admission escaped before I could stop it, carrying 2 years of suppressed frustration. 2 years of treatments, Thurman. 2 years of asking for him, making excuses for him, believing he'd come when it mattered. Thurman nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on Margaret's casket being prepared for transport. "I watched you support that boy for decades. When does it end?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, some lessons can only be learned the hard way." His voice carried the weight of experience, decades of watching friends navigate family crises, career setbacks, personal failures. Margaret protected him from consequences his whole life, made excuses when he disappointed people, covered for him when he hurt feelings. I thought about Timothy's childhood. Margaret rushing to school when he forgot assignments, calling his boss when he overslept, smoothing over conflicts with friends who felt neglected. She'd called it supporting his potential. Looking back, it seemed more like enabling his selfishness. She wanted me to understand him, I said, to forgive him. Understanding someone doesn't mean accepting everything they do. Thurman shifted his weight, the movement deliberate and measured. I had a brother who gambled away his family's savings. My mother kept bailing him out, saying love meant never giving up. Know what happened? I shook my head. He never learned. Kept gambling because consequences never stuck. Sometimes the most loving things letting someone face the results of their choices. Around us, the crowd was thinning as people moved toward their cars or walked to the burial site. Cemetery workers began folding chairs, their movements efficient and practiced. The ceremony's formal structure was dissolving into the messier reality of grief, logistics, and family obligations. "What are you suggesting?" I asked. Thurman was quiet for a long moment, studying my face. "Margaret left him something in the will, didn't she? The house is mine, but there's money, her teacher's pension, some investments. She wanted Timothy to be comfortable, even after he abandoned her." The question hung in the air between us. Margaret had revised her will during the final weeks, ensuring Timothy would inherit enough to maintain his lifestyle. She'd called it faith in his future. I'd seen it as one last attempt to buy the love he'd never freely given. She believed he'd change, I said. Thought responsibility might mature him. "And you? What do you believe?" I watched the funeral director supervising the casket's movement, his staff working with quiet professionalism around Margaret's final journey. In a few minutes, she'd be lowered into ground that had been waiting for her since I'd purchased the plots 20 years ago, back when death seemed distant, and Timothy still called every Sunday. "I believe some people don't change until they have to," I admitted. Thurman nodded. "Don't let this pass, Otis. Don't let him think his mother's death doesn't matter. Some lessons can only be learned the hard way." He clasped my shoulder once firmly, then walked toward his pickup truck without looking back. I stood alone among the scattered funeral programs and wilting flower petals, his words echoing, "Don't let this pass." The graveside service would begin soon, Margaret's final send-off, attended by everyone who'd loved her except the one person whose presence she'd wanted most. I walked slowly toward my car, key in hand, but making no move to start the engine. Through the windshield, I could see my still scanning the parking area, hopefully probably wondering if Timothy's delayed flight had finally landed. Other relatives clustered near their vehicles, waiting for direction about what came next. What came next? That seemed to be the question Margaret had left me with, along with a house full of memories and a son who'd blocked my number to protect his vacation from family interruption. I sat in the driver's seat, key in the ignition but not turning it, contemplating Thurman's words about lessons and consequences. Somewhere in Florida, Timothy was probably posting another beach photo while his mother's body waited for burial, living his best life while avoiding any reminder of the life that had given him everything. Margaret's voice whispered in my memory, "Promise me you'll understand him." But understanding someone, as Thurman had said, didn't mean accepting everything they did. The 30-minute drive home felt like hours. I sat in the driveway for 10 minutes before finally turning off the engine, staring at the house Margaret and I had shared for 28 years. The afternoon sun cast familiar shadows across the front porch, but everything felt different now, emptier, like a movie set after the actors had gone home. I walked to the front door, fumbling with keys that suddenly felt foreign in my hands. The house greeted me with silence so complete it seemed to have weight, pressing against my eardrums until I had to clear my throat just to hear something. Margaret's reading glasses still sat on the kitchen counter beside her crossword puzzle book. Her coffee mug waited in the dish drainer, clean and ready for a morning that would never come. I touched the rim gently, remembering how she'd always drunk her coffee too hot, blowing across the surface while complaining about my patience. Loosening my black tie, I climbed the stairs to our bedroom and methodically removed the funeral suit. Each piece felt like armor I was finally allowed to discard. The jacket that had contained my rage, the shirt that had absorbed my tears, the pants that had carried me through the longest day of my life. I pulled on comfortable jeans and Margaret's favorite sweater of mine, the blue wool one she'd given me 3 Christmases ago. It still smelled faintly of her perfume from the last time she'd hugged me while I was wearing it. Downstairs, I made coffee without thinking, muscle memory guiding my hands through the familiar routine. 2 scoops, not 3. Margaret had always preferred it weaker than I did. Only when the pot finished brewing did I realize I'd automatically pulled down 2 mugs from the cabinet, hers and mine, side by side like they'd been every morning for decades. The sight of that second mug waiting for someone who would never need coffee again nearly broke me. I put hers back and filled mine, then wandered into the living room where framed photographs covered every surface. Our wedding day, Margaret radiant in white lace, me terrified but trying to look confident. Timothy's high school graduation, all 3 of us beaming with pride and possibility. College orientation with Timothy looking sophisticated and independent, while Margaret tried not to cry. More recent photos told a different story. Timothy's marketing award ceremonies where we'd driven 8 hours to watch him accept recognition from colleagues who knew him better than we did. His apartment warming in New York, where he'd seemed embarrassed by our presence among his professional friends. Last Christmas, the final time he'd visited, his smile strained and his attention constantly drifting to his phone. 40 years I raised that boy, I said aloud to Margaret's favorite armchair. 40 years of Little League games, where you cheered louder than any mother in the stands. School plays where you brought flowers, even when he forgot his lines. The chair didn't answer, but I could hear her voice anyway. He's just building his career, Otis. Young people need to focus on their futures. But when does building a future stop being an excuse for abandoning the past? I asked the empty room. When does ambition become selfishness? I sank into Margaret's chair, something I'd rarely done while she was alive. It still held the impression of her small frame, still smelled like the lavender lotion she'd used every night before bed. From here she'd watched her garden bloom through the seasons, read countless books, graded papers from students who'd adored her. Thurman's words echoed in my mind. Some lessons can only be learned the hard way. Margaret had protected Timothy from consequences his entire life. Forgotten homework became her emergency runs to school. Missed deadlines became her phone calls to understanding teachers. Failed responsibilities became our financial safety nets, our emotional cushions, our endless supply of second chances. Even during her illness, she'd made excuses for his absence. He's just scared, she'd whispered after another missed visit. Death frightens young people, as if fear justified abandonment, as if being scared gave him permission to let his mother die alone, except for an increasingly exhausted husband. I picked up the photo from Timothy's college graduation, studying his face for signs of the man he'd become. At 18, he'd still hugged us both without embarrassment, still called every Sunday to share stories about classes and friends and dreams we'd helped him chase. When had that changed? When had our son become someone who could choose a Florida beach over his mother's funeral? The transformation hadn't happened overnight. Looking back, I could trace the gradual cooling, phone calls growing shorter, visits becoming obligations, our lives becoming inconveniences he managed rather than relationships he cherished. Margaret had noticed too, though she'd never admitted it. I'd catch her waiting by the phone on Sundays, hoping for calls that came later and later, until they stopped altogether. She'd mentioned Timothy's name with careful optimism, testing whether today might be the day he remembered he had parents who loved him. "You always saw the best in him, sweetheart," I said to her photograph even when he stopped seeing us at all. The afternoon light was fading, casting longer shadows across the living room. I should eat something, I knew. Should call Mai to let her know I'd gotten home safely. Should begin the process of thanking people for their flowers and condolences. Instead, I sat in Margaret's chair, holding our son's graduation photo, finally allowing myself to acknowledge what she'd never been willing to admit. Timothy had left us long before today. Today, he'd simply made it official. Thurman was right. Some lessons couldn't be learned the hard way. The question was whether I had the courage to teach them. I opened the laptop and waited for it to boot up. My decision crystallizing with each passing second. The familiar desktop appeared. A photo of Margaret in her garden taken last spring when she'd still been strong enough to plant the roses she'd never see bloom. Banking websites required passwords, security questions, verification codes. I'd set up all our financial accounts years ago, back when Margaret had trusted me to handle such things while she focused on teaching and family. Now that trust would serve a different purpose. The bank's blue and white interface loaded with practiced efficiency. Checking account, savings account, mortgage payments, utility bills, all the mundane architecture of a life built together over decades. I navigated to the recurring payment section with engineer's precision, knowing exactly what I'd find. There it was, recurring payment $30 to $100 monthly to Timothy Cole mortgage account. Next scheduled payment April 30th, 2025. Total payment sent 96 transfers. 8 years of monthly payments. Each one representing Margaret's faith that our son would eventually appreciate the sacrifice. Each one proving that love, when not reciprocated, becomes enabling. I clicked the payment history link and watched years of transactions scroll across the screen. March 2025, $3,200, February 2025, $3,200, January 2025, $3,200 sent while Margaret lay dying and Timothy couldn't be bothered to visit. My calculator app confirmed what my engineer's mind had already computed. $3,200 times 12 months times 8 years equals $37,200. $300,000. Margaret and I could have taken that European trip she'd always dreamed about. Could have renovated the kitchen she'd complained about for 15 years. Could have helped a dozen students pay for college instead of subsidizing one ungrateful child's lifestyle. I scrolled further back, finding Timothy's original email from 2017. Dad, I know this is a big ask, but the New York market is crazy expensive. If you could help with the mortgage payments until I get established, I promise I'll pay you back once my career takes off. 8 years later, his career had taken off spectacularly. His social media posts showcased expensive restaurants, luxury vacations, designer clothes, but somehow he'd never gotten around to paying us back. Never even mentioned the possibility. Well, Timothy, I said to the laptop screen, you said the funeral wasn't worth your time. Let's see if your mortgage is worth mine. I clicked manage recurring payment and read the cancellation terms. Immediate effect. No waiting period. No grace period. No notification to the recipient beyond their bank's standard procedures. The confirmation screen appeared. Are you sure you want to cancel this recurring payment? Below that, in smaller text, this action cannot be undone. Future payments will not be automatically sent. I thought about Margaret's voice. Promise me you'll take care of Timothy. I had taken care of him for 35 years. I'd taken care of him, fed him, clothed him, educated him, supported his dreams, funded his lifestyle, enabled his selfishness. I'd taken such good care of him that he'd never learned to take care of himself or anyone else. Maybe it was time for Timothy to learn what taking care of himself actually meant. I clicked yes, cancel payment. The confirmation appeared instantly. Recurring payment canceled. Effective immediately. Confirmation email sent to account holder. My inbox pinged within seconds. Payment cancellation confirmed. Timothy Cole mortgage account will no longer receive automatic transfers from your checking account. 8 years off financial support ended with 2 mouse clicks. I leaned back in the kitchen chair, feeling something I hadn't experienced in months. Lightness. Not the emptiness of grief, but the relief of a burden finally lifted. For the first time since Margaret's diagnosis, I wasn't responsible for someone else's obligations. Timothy would receive his bank's notification within 24 hours. His next mortgage payment was due in 2 weeks. He'd have just enough time to panic, to realize that Daddy wasn't going to handle this particular problem for him. He'd probably call once he discovered his safety net had disappeared, but his number was still blocked in my phone and I had no intention of changing that. Some conversations required earning, and Timothy had significant earning to do. The laptop screen dimmed automatically, asking if I wanted to continue my session. I closed the banking website and shut the computer, pushing it aside with the satisfaction of a job completed. $300,000 Margaret would understand eventually. She'd wanted me to take care of Timothy, but she'd also taught her students that actions had consequences, that responsibility couldn't be learned without practice. Tonight, Timothy was practicing being responsible for his own mortgage. Tomorrow, we'd see how well he'd been paying attention. I walked to the refrigerator with lighter steps than I'd taken in months, opening it to discover possibilities instead of obligations. Margaret had always planned our meals, worried about nutrition, made sure I ate properly even when grief killed my appetite. Tonight, for the first time since her death, I felt genuinely hungry. Eggs, butter, good bread, simple ingredients for a simple meal. I cracked 3 eggs into a bowl and watched them blend into golden smoothness, remembering Margaret's teasing about my legendary scrambled eggs. Only man I know who makes them fluffy as clouds, she'd said. Tonight they were fluffy as clouds. I set the kitchen table with our good dishes, the wedding china we'd saved for special occasions that came too rarely. If eating my first peaceful meal in months wasn't special, nothing was. The plates looked elegant under the warm kitchen lights, reflecting a satisfaction I'd forgotten was possible. First time in months I actually taste my food, I said aloud, savoring each bite. The eggs were perfect, the toast crisp, the butter real instead of the diet substitute Margaret had insisted on. Simple pleasures returned to me along with the freedom to enjoy them. After dinner, I moved to the living room and settled into Margaret's favorite armchair with the remote control. She'd always chosen our evening entertainment, gravitating toward classic films that reminded her of her childhood. Tonight I selected one of her favorites, a Cary Grant romantic comedy that had made her laugh even during the worst days of her illness. Remember this movie, sweetheart? I asked her photograph on the side table. You always said Cary Grant could charm his way out of anything. Maybe you'd approve of a little charm working against Timothy for once. The familiar dialogue washed over me, bringing comfort instead of sadness. Margaret's presence felt lighter tonight, less like an absence and more like a blessing. as if she understood that love sometimes required difficult choices, that protecting someone from consequences wasn't the same as protecting them from harm. My phone sat on the end table, deliberately powered off. For months I'd kept it close, anxious about calls that might bring emergency news, updates about Margaret's condition, or brief conversations with Timothy that left me feeling more alone than silence. Tonight I wanted genuine quiet. No interruptions, no obligations, no disappointments.
"Strange how much lighter the house feels tonight," I murmured, surprised by the truth of it.
Margaret's death had filled every room with her absence, but Timothy's rejection had somehow cleared the air. No more waiting for calls that wouldn't come. No more making excuses for behavior that couldn't be excused. The movie ended near 10 SARD, earlier than I'd usually retire, but later than I'd managed since the funeral arrangements began. I turned off the television and made my way upstairs, moving through the bedtime routine that had felt impossible for weeks. Brushing my teeth, I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror and saw something unexpected. Not happiness exactly, but peace. The kind of calm that comes after making a difficult decision and knowing it was right. In the bedroom, I undressed slowly, hanging my clothes with the care Margaret had always insisted on. "Clothes last longer when you treat them properly," she'd said. And tonight the familiar routine felt like honoring her practical wisdom, rather than mourning her absence. I slipped between clean sheets. I changed them yesterday in preparation for guests who might visit after the funeral, and lay quietly in the darkness, listening to the house settle around me. No racing thoughts about Timothy's next crisis. No anxiety about phone calls I couldn't answer. Just quiet anticipation. Wonder how long it'll take him to notice, I said to the ceiling, genuine curiosity replacing months of worry. Rolling over to Margaret's side of the bed, I spoke to her pillow. "Sleep well, love. Justice is coming." For the first time since her death, I closed my eyes with a genuine smile. Sleep came easily, dreamless and deep. The rest of a man who'd finally stopped carrying burdens that weren't his to bear. Outside, Chicago settled into its nighttime rhythm. But inside our house, peace had returned. Tomorrow would bring Timothy's discovery, his panic, his desperate attempts to restore the financial safety net he'd taken for granted. But tonight belonged to me, to rest, to satisfaction, to the quiet pleasure of consequences, finally catching up with choices. Margaret would have understood. She'd spent 40 years teaching children that actions mattered, that responsibility was learned through practice, that love sometimes meant allowing people to face the results of their decisions. Timothy's education was about to begin. The past week had been the most peaceful I'd known in years. I'd spent mornings tending Margaret's garden, afternoons organizing her belongings with care rather than grief, evenings reading books I'd set aside during her illness. For the first time since her diagnosis, I'd slept through entire nights without waking to check on someone who no longer needed checking. Then Timothy's name appeared on my phone screen. I stared at the display for 3 rings, considering whether to answer. Part of me was curious about what crisis had finally forced him to unblock my number. Another part wanted to let it ring to give him a taste of the silence he'd imposed on me. But mostly I felt nothing. No anxiety, no anger, just mild interest in seeing how long it would take him to acknowledge reality. On the 4th ring, I picked up, "Dad, hey." His voice carried that casual tone I remembered from childhood, when he'd call to ask for rides or money, assuming both would be provided without question. "Sorry I blocked you last week. I just needed some space after, you know." "I understand," I said, settling back into Margaret's chair with my afternoon coffee. Good. Listen, I'm back from Florida now, and there's this weird issue with my mortgage. The bank says my April payment wasn't made. Your automatic transfer must have glitched or something." The assumption in his voice was breathtaking. No mention of the funeral he'd missed. No acknowledgement of his mother's burial. No apology for dismissing 37 years of love as not worth his time. Just an expectation that I'd fix his financial problem, while he moved on to more important matters. "It wasn't a glitch," I said, a pause. I could hear papers rustling in the background. Probably bank statements or mortgage documents he'd never bothered to read before. "What do you mean? Can you just call them and fix it?" "No, that's your responsibility now, Timothy." The silence stretched longer this time. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted from casual to concerned. "My responsibility. Dad, you've always handled this. What's going on?" "What's going on is exactly what you told me last week." "What are you talking about?" The rustling sounds increased as if he were frantically searching through paperwork for answers he'd never needed before. "You said your mother's funeral wasn't worth your time." I kept my voice level, conversational, as if we were discussing the weather. Well, your mortgage isn't worth mine. The explosive silence that followed felt like vindication. I could picture him in his expensive Manhattan apartment, surrounded by the lifestyle my money had helped maintain. Finally beginning to understand that actions had consequences. You can't be serious, he said, his voice climbing toward panic. This is about Mom's funeral. Dad, that was emotional. This is real money we're talking about. Your mother was real, Timothy. Her love for you was real. Her hope that you'd visit during her final weeks was real. I was building my career. I couldn't just drop everything every time she had a bad day. Every time she had a bad day, 2 years of cancer treatments, of watching her shrink and weaken and fade, reduced to occasional inconveniences in his busy schedule. Shetty'd waiting for you to call. I said, do you know that? Her last week she kept asking if you'd phoned. I kept making excuses because I couldn't bear to tell her the truth, that her son was too important to spare 5 minutes for his dying mother. That's not fair. I sent flowers. I called when I could. You called twice in 6 months, both times to ask about her prognosis, never to speak with her directly. The papers stopped rustling. In the silence I could hear his breathing, quick and shallow. The reality was finally penetrating the bubble of self-interest he'd lived in for years. Look, I made mistakes, okay? But you can't punish me by destroying my financial stability. I'm not punishing you. I'm simply no longer enabling you. Enabling? Dad, you promised you'd help with my mortgage. A promise is a promise. The audacity was stunning. Timothy, who'd broken every promise to his dying mother, lecturing me about keeping commitments. And you promised to be there for your family, I replied. You promised to visit your mother. You promised to call more often. Promises work both ways, son. This is different. This was emotional stuff. This is money. This is real. There it was. The core of who Timothy had become. Emotions were optional. Relationships were conveniences, but money was sacred. Margaret's final months had been emotional stuff, while his mortgage was the only reality that mattered. I walked to the window and looked out at Margaret's garden, where spring flowers were beginning to bloom despite her absence. She'd always believed in Timothy's potential, always made excuses for his failures, always hoped he'd grow into the man she'd raised him to be. She'd been wrong. Goodbye, Timothy. I said, Dad, wait. You can't just. I hung up and immediately blocked his number, watching the confirmation appear on my screen. Contact blocked. The same message he'd shown me a week ago when his vacation was more important than his mother's funeral. The house felt quieter after that, but it was a good quiet. The peace of decisions made and consequences accepted. Outside, Margaret's roses were blooming exactly as she'd planted them, beautiful and strong, and requiring no help from anyone who didn't truly care for them. Timothy's name appeared on my phone screen again within minutes. He'd called from a different number, probably his work line, thinking he could circumvent my blocking. I answered on the first ring this time, curious to see how far his desperation would drive him. Don't you dare hang up on me. His voice shot up an octave, revealing the son I remembered from childhood tantrums when he couldn't get his way. Demanding, entitled, unable to accept that the world might not revolve around his needs. I wasn't planning to, I said, settling into Margaret's chair again. This conversation deserved my full attention. You can't just stop paying my mortgage. Do you understand what you're doing to me? I understand exactly what I'm doing. What I don't understand is why you think you're entitled to $3,000 of my money every month. Because you promised when I moved to New York you said you'd help until I got established. That was 8 years ago. Timothy, your salary is 6 figures now. Your bonus last year could have paid your mortgage for 2 years. When exactly were you planning to get established? The question hung in the air. I could hear him breathing hard, probably pacing around his apartment searching for arguments that would restore his financial safety net. It's not about the money, he said finally. It's about family. Family helps each other. The irony was breathtaking. Timothy, who'd abandoned his family when help was needed most, lecturing me about mutual support. You're absolutely right, I said. Family does help each other. When Margaret was dying, your family needed you. Where were you? I was working, building a future. You know how competitive my industry is. And when Shadid, your family needed you at her funeral, where were you? I needed time to process. I couldn't just drop everything and fly to Chicago. You were already in Florida on vacation, posting videos of yourself on the beach while your mother was being buried. Another silence, shorter this time, but heavier. The weight of truth settling into places where excuses used to live. Fine, he exploded. I made mistakes. I wasn't perfect. But you can't destroy my life over it. I'm not destroying anything. I'm just no longer building it for you. This is insane. You're supposed to be my father, and she was supposed to be able to count on her son. Margaret defended you for 35 years. Timothy made excuses when you disappointed friends, covered for you when you broke promises, sent you money when you claimed to need help. She died believing you loved her. I did love her. Then why didn't you show up when love required action instead of words? Because his voice cracked slightly. Because I couldn't handle seeing her like that. Sick and weak and dying. You couldn't handle seeing your mother die, so you left me to handle it alone. You're stronger than me. You always were. I knew you could take care of her. There it was, the final revelation. Timothy hadn't abandoned us because he was busy or ambitious or scared. He'd abandoned us because it was easier to let someone else carry the burden while he lived his comfortable life. Margaret weighed 90 libby when she died, I said quietly. 90 pounds from a woman who used to garden for hours, who taught 30 children every day, who made you lunch every morning before school for 12 years. She spent her final weeks asking about you, hoping you'd call, believing you still cared enough to say goodbye. Stop it, she made me promise to understand you, to forgive you, to keep taking care of you even after she was gone. Then do it, honor her wishes. I am honoring her wishes. I'm teaching you what she never could. That love requires responsibility. That family means showing up. That some promises can't be broken without consequences. Dad, please. I'll lose my apartment. I'll lose everything. And I lost my wife. My partner of 37 years, the woman who made excuses for you until her dying breath. But somehow your mortgage is more important than her memory. It's not the same thing. You're right. It's not. Margaret's death was permanent. Your financial inconvenience is temporary. You have a good job, excellent credit, and 8 years of mortgage payments are made for you. You'll figure something out. What if I don't? What if I can't? Then you'll learn what I learned during Margaret's illness, that some battles you fight alone, some burdens you carry yourself, and some responsibilities can't be delegated to other people. I'm your son. You can't abandon me. The accusation hit like a physical blow, not because it was true, but because of its stunning hypocrisy. Timothy, who'd abandoned his dying mother, claiming abandonment because his father wouldn't pay his bills. And she was your mother, I said. But that didn't stop you from abandoning her when she needed you most. Fine, I was a terrible son. Is that what you want to hear? I was selfish and weak and I let her down. But destroying my life won't bring her back. I'm not destroying your life, Timothy. I'm giving you the chance to build one yourself without my money propping it up. Margaret always believed you had potential. Maybe it's time you found out if she was right. This is about revenge, isn't it? You want me to suffer because I missed the funeral. This is about justice. You chose your vacation over your mother's funeral. Now you get to choose your own solution to your mortgage problem. Same principle, your choices, your consequences. Dad, wait. Goodbye, Timothy. I ended the call and immediately blocked this number too, watching my phone display the same contact blocked message, 2 numbers down, however many he had left to go. But each block number represented a choice. His choice to prioritize convenience over relationship, money over memory, himself over everyone else. The house settled into silence again, but this time it felt final. No more calls, no more crises, no more enabling disguised as love. Timothy would have to learn responsibility the way Margaret had always wanted him to, through practice, consequences, and the discovery that other people's generosity wasn't unlimited. I looked at her photograph on the side table, imagining her reaction to what I'd just done. She might have been shocked initially, but Margaret was a teacher. She understood that some lessons could only be learned through experience, that protecting someone from consequences wasn't the same as protecting them from harm. I think you'd approve, I said to her image. Tough love was always your specialty, even when you couldn't apply it to him. Outside, evening was settling over the neighborhood. Normal people were coming home from normal jobs to normal families who showed up for each other when it mattered. Tomorrow I'd wake up without worrying about Timothy's next crisis, next demand, next assumption that his problems were mine to solve. For the first time in 8 years, my money would stay in my account where it belonged. 3 weeks passed without a single call from Timothy. 3 weeks of the most peaceful mornings I'd had in years, where coffee tasted like pleasure instead of obligation, where newspapers brought information instead of anxiety about which story might trigger my son's next financial crisis. I'd used the time well. Margaret's garden required attention she could no longer provide, and I discovered unexpected satisfaction in continuing work her hands had started. The roses she'd planted were blooming spectacularly, as if her absence had freed them to flourish without constraint. The travel agency on Lincoln Avenue had been helpful when I'd explained what I wanted. A Mediterranean cruise departing in June. The Greek islands Margaret had dreamed about visiting since we'd watched that travel documentary 5 years ago. She'd marked pages in travel magazines, researched restaurants in Santorini, planned excursions to ancient ruins she'd studied as a young teacher. This would be perfect for someone starting fresh, the travel agent had said, spreading brochures across her desk like possibilities made tangible. My wife always wanted to see the Greek islands, I'd replied. I think she'd approve of me finally taking that trip. It's never too late to honor someone's dreams. No, it wasn't. And with $3,000 staying in my account every month instead of subsidizing Timothy's lifestyle, honoring Margaret's dreams had become financially possible. 8 years of mortgage payments translated to years of travel, experiences, adventures she'd postponed while we supported our ungrateful son. The bank manager had been impressed when I'd opened the new savings account. European Cruise Fund, I'd labeled it, watching the balance grow with money that had previously disappeared into Timothy's Manhattan apartment. Numbers on a screen that represented freedom instead of enablement. My phone had stayed blissfully quiet. No desperate calls about mortgage payments. No panicked voicemails about eviction notices. No demands for emergency financial rescues. Whatever Timothy was doing to solve his housing crisis, he was doing it without my involvement. Exactly as it should be. Thurman had called twice, checking on my welfare with the concern of 4 decades of friendship. I'd told him about the cruise, about the garden, about the profound peace that had settled over my life since I'd stopped being Timothy's financial safety net. Margaret would be proud, he'd said. Took you long enough to learn what she always knew. What's that? That sometimes loving someone means letting them learn the hard way. The cemetery visit had become a weekly ritual, bringing fresh flowers from Margaret's garden to place beside her headstone. Today I'd brought news along with the roses. Well, sweetheart, I said, arranging the blooms carefully against the marble. I booked that cruise you always wanted, leaving for Athens in 6 weeks, then sailing to all those islands you circled in the travel guides. A gentle breeze stirred the flowers, as if she approved. Timothy called a few times after he lost his mortgage payment. Seemed surprised that actions have consequences. Imagine that. I settled into the familiar rhythm of one-sided conversation that had developed since her death. You always said I was too soft on him. Turns out you were right. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cemetery grounds, peaceful and eternal. Other visitors moved quietly among the headstones, bringing their own flowers, sharing their own news with loved ones who could no longer respond, but somehow still listened. $300,000, I continued. That's what we spent on his mortgage over 8 years. Enough for that kitchen renovation you wanted? That European trip you postponed? Maybe help a few deserving students pay for college instead of enabling one ungrateful child. Margaret's photograph smiled from its weatherproof frame. The same expression she'd worn when discussing difficult students who'd finally grasped challenging concepts. Patient understanding but firm in her belief that learning required effort. Growth demanded struggle and love sometimes meant saying no. I think you understand why I did it. I said, you spent 40 years teaching children that choices have consequences, that responsibility can't be delegated, that growing up means handling your own problems. Maybe it's time Timothy learned what you always tried to teach him. The drive home took me through neighborhoods where I'd lived my entire adult life, past schools where Margaret had taught, through communities where we'd built friendships that would outlast my son's resentment. Chicago in late spring was beautiful. Trees budding, families emerging from winter hibernation, life continuing its ancient cycle of renewal and growth. At home I made dinner with ingredients I'd chosen for pleasure rather than economy, eating slowly while planning tomorrow's garden work. The house felt lighter without the weight of Timothy's endless needs, more spacious without his problems crowding every corner. My new passport had arrived yesterday, crisp and official, ready for adventures Margaret and I had planned but never taken. The cruise itinerary sat on the kitchen counter beside travel guides to Greek islands. Roman ruins, Mediterranean ports where ancient civilizations had flourished and faded, leaving lessons about the importance of building something lasting. Timothy would learn to build his own life now without my money as foundation. Whether he succeeded or failed would depend on qualities Margaret had tried to instill. But I'd undermined through enabling resilience, responsibility, the understanding that love meant earning as well as receiving. The evening news played softly in the background. Stories of distant conflicts and local triumphs. Reminders that the world continued spinning regardless of individual struggles. Somewhere in New York, Timothy was probably apartment hunting, learning what $3,000 really meant when it came from his own paycheck instead of his father's generosity. I felt no guilt about his situation, no urge to rescue him from consequences he'd created. Margaret had died hoping he'd grow into the man she'd always believed he could become. My enabling had prevented that growth for years, but no longer. Outside, spring was turning towards summer. Margaret's garden blooming with colors she'd chosen, fragrances she'd loved, beauty she'd cultivated with her own hands. In 6 weeks, I'd board a ship bound for places she dreamed of seeing, carrying her memory to islands where ancient wisdom still whispered about the eternal human struggle between love and accountability. The phone remained silent and the silence was perfect. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.